There is a body in the ground in the upper Volga. A man, buried roughly 1,000 years ago in the dark forest north of where Moscow would one day rise. His grave is unremarkable. Wood, bone, a few iron things rusted to lace. But the scientists know what he is. Or they think they do. They open his bones, pull out the long quiet thread of his DNA, and read it like a sentence written before there were words for any of this. And the sentence does not say what you would expect. This man is not exactly what we call Russian today. He is not what his grandchildren will be. He is not even what his neighbors are. He is something older, something that does not have a name in any modern flag. You have probably been told a clean story about who the Russians are. Slavs, from somewhere east of Europe. The same family as the Poles, the Czechs, the Serbs. A great forest people who spread across the plain and built a nation on it. It is not wrong. But it is the wrapper. Under the wrapper, the story is much stranger. Because if you ask a geneticist to draw a line around the Russian people, the geneticist has a quiet problem. There is no single line. Northern Russians, the ones whose grandparents come from the cold lakes and pine forests near Arkhangelsk and Vologda, are not, in the language of DNA, fully Slavic at all. They cluster with the Finns. They cluster with the Estonians. You can put them on a chart, and the chart will not place them next to Warsaw. It places them next to Helsinki. Southern Russians, the ones from the warmer Black Earth country, cluster somewhere else entirely. They sit close to Ukrainians and Belarusians. Same neighborhood, different room. So already, before we have even begun, the question changes. It is no longer who are the Russians. It is which Russians, from where, braided with whom. I sat with that for a while. The fact that, on a genetic map, half of one country sits next to a different country, the other half sits next to yet a third, and both halves call themselves the same name. That is not a contradiction, that is a clue. Because the truth about Russian origins is not about a people, it is about a meeting. To understand the meeting, we have to start somewhere else. Not in Russia, not yet. We have to start in a swampy stretch of country between two slow rivers. The Dniester to the west, the Don to the east. Today this land is split between southern Belarus and central Ukraine. 1,500 years ago, it was almost invisible to history. The Romans did not write about it. The Greeks did not write about it. The people who lived there did not write about it. They left no monuments. They left no kings. They cremated their dead, which means they left almost no bones for science to read. For a long time, that absence was a wall. We could see the empire of Byzantium on one side, and the Germanic kingdoms on the other, and in the middle, a kind of fog. And then, in the 6th century, something walks out of that fog. A people, speaking one language, moving in many directions. They go west, into what is now Germany. They go south, into the Balkans. They go north, into the deep forests. And they keep going, generation after generation, until they have filled almost half of Europe. We call them the Slavs. But for centuries, we had no idea where they actually came from. Until 2025. This year, a team led by the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig finally cracked it open. They sequenced more than 550 ancient skeletons from across Central and Eastern Europe. They built the first real genetic map of who lived where and when, and what changed when the Slavs arrived. The lead geneticist on the project, Joscha Gretzinger, gave the answer that linguists had suspected for 100 years. The Slavic homeland sits between the Dniester and the Don. Southern Belarus, central Ukraine. That fog-covered country. That is where the people who would one day call themselves Russian first began to be a people at all. But here is the part that stopped me. When those Slavs began to move, in the 6th and 7th centuries, they did not just spread, they replaced. In eastern Germany, after the older kingdoms collapsed, more than 8 out of every 10 people in the soil are newcomers. Their bones are not the bones of the people who were there a century before. In Poland, in parts of the Balkans, same pattern. The local gene pool of entire regions is overwritten in 2 or 3 generations. This is not a slow cultural drift. This is not, they learned the new language. This is a continent-sized human reshaping. People got up and they walked, and where they walked, the people there were no longer who they had been. The senior author of that study put it as plainly as a geneticist can. The Slavic expansion was probably the last demographic event in European history, big enough to permanently rewire both the genes and the languages of a continent. That is the Russian root, half of it, the Slavic half. But these people were not walking into an empty country. Now we go back to the man in the upper Volga, the grave, the bones the scientists read. Around him, in the forests of what would one day be central Russia, lived a people we have almost forgotten. They were not Slavs. They had been there for centuries before the Slavs arrived, maybe much longer. They were called, by the Slavs who finally met them, the Merya. You have probably never heard of the Merya. Almost no one has. Their name appears in the oldest Russian chronicle as a kind of footnote. There were also the Merya, it says, the way you might mention a tribe you barely registered. But they were there. They lived around the great cold lakes north of Moscow, Lake Nero, Lake Pleshcheyevo, dark water in dark forest. They built fortified hilltop towns. They made beautiful bronze jewelry shaped like horses and birds, and women with no faces. They fished. They traded amber. They spoke a Finno-Ugric language, a quiet cousin of modern Finnish and Estonian, a language that does not sound at all like Russian and was never written down. By the 10th century, when the Slavs began arriving in their territory in serious numbers, the Merya were a settled, sophisticated, ordinary nation going about their lives in the forest. And then, slowly, over about 2 centuries, they were gone. Not killed, not driven out. There is no archaeological wave of destruction. There are no mass graves. The Slavs and the Merya simply lived next to each other, then with each other, then in each other. The Merya children grew up speaking the new language. Their grandchildren did not remember the old one. By the 18th century, the last fluent Merya speaker had probably died, and the language went into the ground with him. But the bodies did not go. When geneticists looked at the people now living in those exact same forests, the people of Yaroslavl and Kostroma and the small towns around Moscow, they found something they had not expected. The bones in the medieval cemeteries are between 1/3 and 3/4 Uralic, Finno-Ugric, Merya. Stop and feel that for a second. The Merya did not vanish. They became the Northern Russians. The grandmother in the village near Vologda, who looks, to a Finnish visitor, oddly familiar. There is a reason. She is, in part, what the Merya turned into. Her bones, if you read them like a sentence, would be partly written in a language she has never heard. The river you cross to get to that village, whose name has no meaning in Russian, no root in any Slavic tongue, is a Merya word. It has been sitting there in the landscape for 1,000 years, waiting for someone to ask. Even the name Moscow itself, the capital of the largest country on earth, may not be a Slavic word at all. Many linguists believe Moscow is a Merya word. The river name came first. The city took the name of the river. The river took the name of a people who, by the time the city was important, did not exist anymore as a people. That is the heart of it. A whole nation, language, culture, memory, dissolved like sugar in water. And the water remembers. The DNA remembers. The names of rivers remember. The faces in the village remember. This is what the science is actually saying when it strips off all the technical words. The Russians are not a people who replaced someone. They are, in the north, a people who absorbed someone, quietly, without writing it down, and then forgot they had done it. Now I have to deal with something you might be expecting me to say. The Mongols. There is an old line, attributed to a French marquis who hated Russia, that has followed the Russian people around for 2 centuries. Scratch a Russian, and you will find a Tatar. It is supposed to mean that under the European surface of the Russian, there is a horseman from the steppe, an Asian conqueror, a leftover of the Mongol invasion that crushed the medieval Russian principalities in the 13th century. It is one of the most famous things anyone has ever said about Russians. It is also, almost entirely, wrong. When scientists go looking for Mongol DNA in modern Russians, they find almost nothing. From the Volga westward, into the European heart of Russia, into Moscow itself, the trace of East Asian ancestry is essentially 0. From the Volga to the Urals, barely 0.5%. Even deep into Asian Russia, on the edge of the Pacific, where Russians have lived alongside Asian peoples for centuries, the trace climbs only to around 3. The Mongol yoke crushed Russian cities. It bent Russian politics. It froze Russian trade and turned Russian princes into vassals for 200 years. It did all of that. But genetically, on the level of bodies, it left almost no mark. This is one of those moments where the science does something gentle and devastating at the same time. The story everyone tells about Russia, the cliché the West loves and the Slavophiles bristle at, is not in the bones. What is in the bones is something almost no one talks about. The Vikings. When the first Russian state appeared in the 9th century, it was not founded by Russians. It was founded by a small band of Scandinavian warriors and traders who came down the great river roads from the Baltic. They were called, by the local Slavs and Finns, the Rus. That word is where the entire country gets its name. The Rus were Vikings, Norwegian, Swedish, Danish in origin. They built fortified river towns at Staraya Ladoga and Novgorod and Kiev. They married into the local Slavic and Finnic nobility. They took Slavic names within 2 or 3 generations. By the year 1000, the descendants of the Viking founders of Russia were already Russians. Their bodies show up in the medieval cemeteries near Pskov and Yaroslavl. Scandinavian Y-chromosomes, Scandinavian burial goods, Scandinavian women buried beside them sometimes, because the trade was that real and that long. That is a 3rd strand. So now look at what you have. The Slavs, who walked out of the forests between the Dniester and the Don. The Maria and the other Finno-Ugric peoples, who were already in the northern forests when the Slavs arrived, and quietly became part of them. The Rus, the Vikings, who came from the cold north and built the state. And running under all of them, older than any of them, a thread of steppe ancestry from a vanished people called the Yamnaya, who came roaring out of the grasslands north of the Black Sea around 5,000 years ago and put the first Indo-European language and the first horses into nearly every European population we know. 4 threads, different worlds, different centuries, different reasons. When a modern Russian geneticist tries to identify the portion of the gene pool that is, in any meaningful sense, only Russian and nothing else, the number comes back small. One large study put it at around 1/6. 5 out of every 6 pieces of the Russian genome are pieces shared with someone else. Pieces that arrived from somewhere else, at some other time, with someone whose name we may not even know. That is the shock of it. The Russians are not a people who appeared out of the soil of Russia. They are a place where 4 enormous human currents met and slowed and stayed. I want to linger on this for a moment because I think it matters. The standard story of any large nation is the story of replacement. Someone was here. We came. We won. We are what is here now. That story is told everywhere, in every language, on every continent. But the genetic story of Russia is not really that story. The Russians did not arrive and erase. They arrived and absorbed. They walked into a country full of older peoples. They learned their rivers. They married their daughters. They forgot their languages. They kept their bones. And the older peoples, the Meria and the Mordvin and the Mari, and the long-vanished tribes that the chronicles only barely name, did not disappear. They became the new neighbors. They became the next generation. When a northern Russian villager looks across a frozen lake today and feels, without being able to say why, that the land is hers, she is not wrong. She is, in part, the great-great-great-great-granddaughter of people who watched that exact lake freeze for thousands of years before there was a word for Russia. When a southern Russian farmer looks at the black earth of his field and feels that this soil is his, he is not wrong either. His ancestors walked north out of the country between the Dniester and the Don, and another set of his ancestors had been there to greet them. The country we call Russia today is built on top of forgotten countries. And the forgotten countries did not really die. They got woven in. That is, I think, the part that gets lost when we argue about nations. Nations are loud. DNA is quiet. There is one more thing the science is starting to say, and I want to be careful with it because it is genuinely unresolved. When you draw a genetic map of the Russians and the Ukrainians and the Belarusians, the three nations that today insist on being three nations, you do not get three clean clusters. You get a smear. The southern Russians blend almost without a break into the Ukrainians and the Belarusians. The northern Russians peel off into the Finnic world. The western Ukrainians blend into the Poles. There is no border in the bones. This does not mean those three nations are not real. They are. Their histories, their churches, their languages, their dead, are real. A nation is not the same thing as a gene pool, and the people fighting over those borders are not fighting over genetics. But it does mean something about the deep past. The deep past says that long before there was a Russia or a Ukraine or a Belarus, there was one great Eastern European population with a Slavic spine and a Baltic substrate and a Finnic edge and a Viking gloss on top. The names came later. The borders came much, much later. The DNA was first. Now we come back to the man in the upper Volga, the body in the ground, the bones the scientists read. When they finished reading him, they put a label on him. The label is technical. It contains numbers. It contains percentages. It contains references to populations he never knew existed. But if you strip the label away, here is what they were saying. This man was not Slavic. Not entirely. He was not Finnic either. Not entirely. He carried a piece of the steppe pastoralist who rode in 5,000 years ago, and a piece of the forest people who had been there before anyone could remember, and a piece of the Slav who walked north from a country far to the south, and maybe even a piece of the Viking who came down the river road from the Baltic. He did not know any of this. He had no idea he was a meeting place. He probably did not think of himself as much of anything beyond the village he lived in and the family he was buried next to. The word Russian would not exist for centuries after his death. He would not have understood it. The country we now call Russia would not have made sense to him as a shape. But he is, in a way that is almost unbearable to think about, the answer to the question we started with. The shocking genetic origin of the Russians is not really one origin at all. It is four. It is a place on the map where the steppe and the forest and the river and the southern plain all met and stayed and became each other. That is what the bones are saying. A people the world thinks it knows. A name everyone has an opinion about. A flag on a million news broadcasts. And under all of it, quiet and slow and only readable in the long thread of DNA, a much older and much gentler story. Not a conquest, a confluence. Not a single people claiming a single land, but four peoples becoming one in the dark of the forests and along the slow water of the rivers, while the centuries kept moving and nobody bothered to write any of it down. The man in the grave does not know we know, but we do. And maybe that is what the science is really for. Not to take an identity away from anybody, not to settle an argument, just to lift, very gently, one corner of the past, and to show what was always there, woven into the people who walk above the buried. That somewhere under the loudest name on the modern map, there is a much older, much quieter, much more human thing. Four currents, one country, a story still being told.